I'm Stuart Yasgur, and this is Economic Architecture, the podcast. For those of you who've been with us since the beginning, from our conversations with Mark Brown on making communities more climate resilient, through actionable changes like fireproof fences, to our episode 6 conversation with Dave Winokur on wildfire mitigation and implementing accessible, actionable regulations like Zone Zero, in many of our conversations thus far, we've looked at the structural innovations at the local and national levels, spreading awareness about wildfire risk. But the necessity of responding urgently and accurately to the many places fires can strike is another crucial element of mitigating the impacts of fire damage.
Rather than having to play a guessing game, perhaps, or using the best model we have, how about us having the right model, not just the best we've got?
There are many risks we ignore when it comes to fire, like the physical distance between buildings to help limit the speed at which fire spreads, to the materials used to build a structure. But how can we better calculate which variables need to be prioritized to make homes as fireproof as possible? And how do we better educate ourselves on these threats to understand our own risks and act faster?
I often say, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that's what was said about the Palisades. That's what was said about many of the communities in California and Colorado and New Mexico. It's not a matter of if, it's when. Because we have to think forward and get in front of fire. This is why we must talk about the risk environment that is not just the built environment, but what else is happening that's changing the dynamic, and that what else is the climate. We are watching fundamental shifts in climate, extreme heat, long periods of drought.
I sat down with the incredible Lori Moore-Merrell. She is the former United States Fire Administrator. She helped me understand both the importance of assessing the risk of fire threat in your home and your community, and the many structural considerations like implementing certain regulatory codes that are vital to improving our risks from these variables. And finally, how we build our homes and our communities in safer ways.
So my former role, I was the United States Fire Administrator. Now, a lot of people don't know what that is, or that we even have a fire administrator. So don't feel left out there. I encountered that quite often. The fire administration was actually created by a piece of legislation that came about in 1974. Now, the legislation was called the Fire Prevention and Control Act. And that act was based on a report that was released in 1973 called the America Burning Report. And the America Burning Report was really put in place to document the fire death and the impact of fire on the economy at the time. It was recording up to 12,000 deaths from fire a year in this nation. And so it led to this piece of legislation that really sought to change that. So the legislation established the United States Fire Administration with a mission to really attack the fire problem. And the fire problem then from 4 different arenas. And those arenas are, if you ever see the U.S. Fire Administration, maybe you can look it up and see the logo. It's an eagle with 4 stars above it. And the 4 stars are for training, for research, for data, and for community risk reduction. And so those 4 stars are still as applicable today. Here we are 51 years later as they were back then. And so that was the mission, and that still is today, the mission of the U.S. Fire Administration. And that's what I did within my tenure there as the U.S. Fire Administrator. That just came to a close in January of this year.
It's so interesting to learn the history of it and where it's come from. When you say fire, I think people have very different pictures of what they mean. Is this the fire that happens in my kitchen, or is this the fire that happens in the woods? How do we think about that?
Oh, I love that question. We really have to put fire in context, don't we? So is it the kitchen fire? Is it your house? Is it the wildfire, or is it lithium ion battery fires? So we really have fire in all arenas today, and far too much of it. Lithium ion batteries. If you own a scooter, a hoverboard, any kind of micromobility thing, and you are charging it in your house, please don't. Find a place outside to charge your products. And certainly if you're charging them, don't get an aftermarket charger, because typically if you go cheap, you are going to overheat those batteries, and it's going to put them into something called runaway, thermal runaway. And once they're in thermal runaway, you may have about 20 seconds before you get a full explosion. And depending on how fully charged that battery is, how big that explosion is going to be. If it's blocking a door because you're charging it in your laundry room, going out to the garage, guess what's going to happen? You're not getting out that door. If you're charging it in your bedroom next to your bed, you're not getting out of that room, because that is 20 seconds is not enough time for you to escape if something is exploding. And so this is our new environment. These are the products that we now have in our home. And if you're an EV driver, an electric vehicle driver, good, that's fantastic. However, if you are using or have plugged in an extension cord to charge your vehicle, please stop, because these are the kinds of things and behaviors that are going to cause that battery to improperly charge, potentially causing, again, a chemical reaction called a thermal runaway. And once you do that, now it can ignite your car, not only your car in your garage, blow off the garage door. We've seen all kinds of videos like this, and ignite your home. And so these are the kinds of risks that we now have in our home that everyone must be alert, because putting fire in these contexts matters. And there's something to learn to really mitigate or manage your risk in each of these environments, depending on where you live. And so the problem is really resurging. And I've seen data recently to say, okay, the fire incidents are down, but the severity of the fires that happen are much worse. And so we really have to think about that. So what is the context? It really is about your home. The folks who die from fire die in their home. So almost 75% of the deaths that happen that are fire related are in your home. And so this tells us that we are having issues today with how our construction, what are our building materials, what are we bringing into the home that makes the fire so fast you can't get out in time. And so you can just look at the news and you'll see that we're talking more and more about fast fire. So it is in the home. But we're also talking about wildfire. We just saw what we call a community conflagration that happened in January of this year. That was a wildfire initiated community conflagration. And these are words we haven't used since the 1800s for talking about the Great Chicago Fire. And the fire that happened in LA, the fuel from that fire was more of the structures themselves. The structures became the fuel that then fed the fire. And so we saw this heavy fuel load and what happened with the disaster in January. So that's another context around fire. And then I mentioned lithium ion batteries because we have this need for continued electrification. We have a need for to be green, right? We want to be energy efficient and try to reduce our carbon footprint, all of those things. So lithium ions had a huge role in that. So we need that to be present, but we need it to be safe. And what we're learning is that lithium ion battery packs, particularly if they've been damaged or put in water, or for whatever reason they have dents or overcharged, then they can go into runaway and they become the source of the fire. And they bring their own fuel load. I talked about the houses it being a fuel load. This is a chemical reaction and it brings its own energy. And so these are very different fires and have fundamentally changed the way we are looking at fighting fire today, because you can't just extinguish those the same way you do a burning couch or a burning home or other more organic materials. And so we really have to put fire today in these three contexts and talk about it more openly, because the risk to people from fire continue to escalate.
It's really interesting to hear, and just the breadth of different contexts we're looking at, and that you were looking at in one office. I think especially the fires that happened in January in LA were so devastating and so shocking because of their speed, the magnitude with which it happened. There's a lot of kind of concern about the existence of wildfire, but I think also helping us recognize the difference between wildfires, which may need to exist because of a natural part of the system for wildlands to burn and to replenish, and to separate that out from the risk from wildfires, which may be really affected by things that are under our control. Some of the things you already mentioned, the building materials, how we build, where we build, what we do in between the buildings, what we do between where we're building and what the wildlands look like. And also to help us recognize that it's, when so many of us think about fire, we think about the rescue moment with the fire engines, the firefighters coming, as opposed to the risk moment. And how do we make those choices about that will result in either a higher or lower risk? How do you start to think about that and the importance of thinking about risk as it relates to fire?
Oh my goodness. We literally, over the past years, have built homes and communities right in the path of fire. And what I mean by that is we have cleared lands that have historically burned. And you mentioned that good fire, there is good fire because good fire that was on the lands in the forest that helped perpetuate some of the vegetation. Some of the trees, some of the vegetation actually depend on fire to perpetuate. And with that kind of fire taken away because we've gone into full on suppression. We suppress every fire. But some of that is because we've now cleared those fire prone lands and put communities there. Now, just because we cleared the trees doesn't mean that geography is any less fire prone. And that's where we've missed the mark because somehow people think that, okay, now that community is safe and we don't have to build a code. There are things in science that we know we need to do. One of them is building codes. We have the science. It's unquestionable that we need to build a code if you're going to be in a hazard environment. And so this land where we've built and we've allowed communities to be put in these places, not built to the code for fire. And that means they've got combustible materials in there, not just in their siding, but on their roof, perhaps. They've got risks that are built in and combustibles around their home. And so these things just can't be. And so this is why I say we've increased our own risk. We continue to do that. And so what we need to do is to think forward in that we must now back out of this problem because we're not going to change that risk profile with new construction going forward. We've got enough existing construction or existing homes, existing businesses that are in trouble and they are in risk areas. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And that's what was said about the Palisades. That's what was said about many of the communities in California and Colorado and New Mexico. It's not a matter of if, it's when, because we have to think forward and get in front of fire. We continue to talk about risk and we continue to talk about the fact that we don't have enough firefighters in this nation to stay in response mode. I can tell you that we'll go back to the Palisades and the Eaton fire. Those were the two biggest ones in California that where there was life lost. And there were over 9,000 firefighters. At the height, there was over 11,000 firefighters fighting those fires. And that sounds astronomical. There are some states that don't have that many. And so when we see those forces that are out there and they're fighting and they are overwhelmed and outpaced by this fire, we know that something has changed, fundamentally changed. And what else is happening that's changing the dynamic? And that what else is the climate? We are watching fundamental shifts in climate, extreme heat, long periods of drought. You might have some rain that causes some growth of vegetation, it greens up, but as soon as the drought hits, all of that lovely vegetation dries and it now becomes what we refer to as fast fuel, which means if there's an ignition, that's going to feed fire very quickly. And so we need people to understand the difference in the area you live, in the property that you have built that you believe is an asset, but because of risk and unmitigated risk, right? Unmanaged risk, that very asset that you claim can actually become the fuel for peril. It can become the very fuel that takes it out and causes disaster. And so we really have to have this shift in our paradigm of how we think about risk, particularly in our own individual space, in our own homes.
And I think, if you look at the frequency and the magnitude of these, especially the wildfires and the impacts they're having and the effects that those have on people's lives, the trends all suggest a common direction, right? This is getting much more severe. So the specter of the risk, I think, is real and visceral. I think it's also important for people to recognize the possibilities for mitigation and the effect that really effective mitigation can have in decreasing that risk. Can you share a little bit about that so people can understand also the possibilities for taking action here?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what we want. It's not like there's no hope here, but hope's not a strategy. So we have to take action. And so
Right.
we really need people to take a look at their home, know where you live, first of all. And there are maps that you can find. USFA, we develop maps, and you can go and just take a look for U.S. Fire Administration, Embercast maps, or Wildland Urban Interface, or WUI. Sometimes we say WUI maps, and you'll be able to actually put in your address and see if you live in an interface area, or if you live in an area that may have Embercast. Embercast became this new verbiage that we use to describe what happened in LA, because it wasn't just the radiant fire spread from structure to structure. It was really this big embers from the structures that were burning that were being cast in the wind 1, 2, 3 miles away and igniting other homes that far away. The other thing I want people to think about is, what kind of building materials are your house made from? Is it combustible material? What do you have in your roof? What kind of roof do you have? Do you have vents that are covered up by some sort of metal mesh so embers cannot get in through your exterior facing vents? What about what's around your home within 5 feet, 10 feet? And maybe you've heard of Zone Zero. That was in the news a lot after the California fires. And that's the first 5 feet around your home. And that is really to be non combustibles. That's no garbage cans, no children's toys, no beautiful flower bushes, no flowers in pots, anything like that can burn or ignite at a heat sufficient enough to ignite your home. So, zone zero is the first 5 feet, no combustibles. And then from there, we go 10 feet and we start to talk more about wood sheds or outbuildings or wood fences. If you're in a fire prone land, those you cannot have those. Having vegetation growing on your privacy fence that is now dry because of the drought. These are exactly the kinds of fuel loads that we saw igniting structures throughout Los Angeles. So no mulch, use stone, right? Use some nice, beautiful rocks, not mulch around your home. So little things like that people can do that make a real difference. One of the other things that I would say to people to watch, if you live and discover you live in a fire prone land, watch and stay alert for red flag warnings. Don't take those for granted. If you hear your weather person say red flag warning, then it should mean something to you. It means if you've got deck furniture that is combustible, your beautiful wicker with the nice cushions, bring it in or put it in your garage. Because if there's an ignition, that is now fuel, and that fuel will ignite your home.
I think one of the things you mentioned is also just the extent to which there's information available. And I know that you played a real role in helping us create entirely new sources of that kind of information. Could you tell us about how far we've come and what we should start to look at as we're looking at these kinds of questions?
Absolutely. So let's talk just a minute about the insurance space. And I think if that sets the context, everybody, if you own a home, you're going to need insurance, particularly if you have a mortgage, right? And so we all want to have insurance. But the insurance market, because of all of these multi-billion-dollar disasters, is really under threat themselves. Rather than have them leave, we want to help make their risk calculations better. Because if we can do that, then they know where they can insure, and they know what the premiums will be, and they can do it accurately rather than having to play a guessing game, perhaps, or using the best model we have. How about us having the right model, not just the best we've got? And so that's what we've been working on. From my tenure, I started it, and then it has continued on since I left office. But the Fire Risk Index. Now, what is that? It is a risk calculation that can be applied to your home. And for fire, it must not just be your home, but it's got to be to your neighbor's home. In fact, your community. So if you live in a cul-de-sac, or if you live in a place where your home is near someone else's and you don't have a lot of great structural separation, there's not a lot of space between your homes, then it must be applied to all of the homes because of the reasons we've already discussed, that your homes become the risk or the fuel that may ignite other homes. And so this risk index would be applied, and it would consider variables like your structural separation, like your roof materials, your siding materials, people that live in the home, all of those things that apply risk to the equation. And so today, we are able to model and look at fire spread potential given the fuel load in the forest, right? If we just look at the wild land, we can model vegetation very well and tell you how the fire is going to burn. We add wind to it, no problem. But for the built environment, once that fire hits the built environment, whether it's in the interface or if there's a grass fire, like was in the Marshall Fire in Colorado in 2021, that just ignites the first structure. Now we need to understand how this fire is going to move through the built environment. What does your home contribute for fuel load? What does your neighbor's home contribute for fuel load? What does the wind matter? How's it going to move between your home and your neighbor's? Where is it going to go? Where is it going to blow the embers? And today we do not have a solid, robust index to show all of those variables and the weight, because some of them will be more important than others. We need to understand the weighting so I can say to you, it is more important that you change your siding. If you can only afford to do something, and not all of it, then change your siding, not your roof. Or I need to say you need to change your roof and do concrete around your home, but your siding should be okay if you do that, right? So we don't know what is the most important and how to rank that. And that's going to be absolutely vital going forward. And it's vital for the insurers to know. It's vital for us to help people help themselves. I don't know a lot of people that don't have limited resources. We have to make choices about the changes we can make in our home. Roofs are expensive. Siding, windows. Oh my goodness, if windows show up to be like really, really important. So this index will help us understand and better inform what changes you can make, and the value of that change then applies to your risk index that will be used by your insurer then to adjust whether they can insure and what your premiums will be. So this is not an easy proposition because we've not tracked over time building materials for homes. We've not enforced codes. We have not really applied the building codes that we know to apply in many communities because we've said, okay, we can build faster and cheaper if we don't build a code. And there are a lot of communities like that. There's a lot of folks working on this, a lot of really bright people. But the lead on it right now is in the UL Fire Safety Research Institute. And they are working with the Department of Homeland Security still, science and technology, to continue to work this problem. But there are a lot of other players at the table because that's how important this is.
That's remarkable. Yeah, it boggles the mind to start to imagine all these different data sources being able to be put together. How do we just imagine that time scale wise? Is this the kind of problem we're going to be talking about in 10 years? Or is this the kind of thing that could be done within a few years' time and that could be actionable?
So I think there are a lot of dynamics at play. Yes, for individuals, we want to move them as quickly as possible. But as we've mentioned, not everybody's going to be able to afford to make these changes that they need to make. And so there'll be a question of, can we apply some technology to their home? Maybe it's just putting on exterior sprinklers or something else that can wet down the property. Or are there other things that can be done? Or must we stay on the retrofit path to really change? So I think that's one. I think policymakers, whether it is a governor or whether even mayors or city councils who have the power to put in place a code and hold fast to that code and enforce that code, that's going to matter. And we watched as Governor Newsom do that almost immediately following the Palisades fire. They implemented Zone Zero, and it's it. We need 5 feet, non-combustibles. And often you'll hear firefighters talk about defensible space. That 5 feet is not only defensible space for them to get in and try to defend your home. So that's one way it's defensible, but it's also defensible that you may need it to be able to get out, right? If the fire is approaching and your home's already ignited. But we need decision makers, policymakers to enforce, pass them, adopt them. And then we need, I think the third piece of that is insurance. We really need the insurers to use their leverage to get action. If you've got a mortgage, then we've got to figure out how to harden your home, is often what we say. Fire adapt your home. We can do that. Your home can be fire adapted. And so then you can have insurance. And what does that look like from a premium perspective? And so we need the insurers to, first of all, leverage their capability to get action from individuals and then not walk away from the market, but actually apply insurance to the problem. And so there's this whole dynamic that I think comes to play from individuals, policymakers, and the insurers.
And you named one in terms of what California's done in implementing Zone Zero and the transition to Zone Zero. Are there other examples of success that people can look to?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We have a wildland urban interface code, WUI. I mentioned that earlier, WUI, if I say WUI. But that's where the built environment meets the forested areas, right? And so we have a WUI code. The International Code Council actually has this code, but only 2 states have adopted it. Go and have a look, if you will. Just look up Maryland, which is a little strange, I know, and California. Those are the 2 states that have adopted the WUI code. Now, adopting the code is one thing, as I said to you, and those are success stories. We have 2 states that have done that. And there's about 240 or so cities or municipalities that have done that in other states. So it can be done at a municipal level or a state level. But enforcing it is a different matter, right? We really need to have that authority. And a lot of that authority was taken away from fire departments and given to building plan agencies or whatever within local government. When the fire departments were responsible for that, then we had, from a fire perspective, a much more hands-on approach to code enforcement. And some of that's gone by the wayside. I can tell you, New York is one of the best, though. They still have their fire marshals. Their codes enforcement is still in the fire department, and it is very effective. And we've seen some of that play out as a model around the lithium-ion battery fire issue, where they have reduced greatly the number of lithium-ion battery fires they were having from micromobility, and they reduced from the death count they were having of up to 18 a year down to 6. So
Wow.
there's still work to be done, but their enforcement, their public education, these things work. We know they work. We watched it work back in the 70s when we were first putting in building codes, and when we were talking about fire alarms, and we were talking about interior sprinklers, which are very important, residential sprinklers, by the way. And that's in part of this WUI code. So these things work.
Building on that, when people see the problem, they start to understand the problem. What can they do? Where are the opportunities for action?
I want them to think in their home, first of all. If we talk about it where we started, that most people die in their home, and that applies to wildfire too. A lot of people who died did not evacuate. Maybe they weren't able to evacuate. There's a whole host of variables that could have surrounded the why. But we need to think about, if you have a fire approaching, pay attention to the alerts and warnings, and pay attention to any evacuation. It is not like you have time. If they have given an order, there is no time left. It's immediate. It's not like I got time to pack up. No, you should be packed with a ready, set, go mindset. And ready, set is not after there's an ignition. Ready, set's right now. Get ready. Have a go bag prepared. Set is once we have an ignition, right? Now you've been alerted. Okay, something's happening. And then go time is go. It's not now, oh, I got to go grab my charger. No, go, especially if you're in a fire prone land. The other thing is to look around your home. I started by saying the frequency of fires have perhaps gone down, but the severity is much worse. So when we have a fire, because of the contents in our homes, they are incredibly fast. The time for firefighters to intervene, it used to be 3-4 minutes from the time that there was an ignition until you really started to see fire spread, because the fabrics that we had in our home were heavy cottons, you had heavy woods. These things don't burn fast. And so these organic materials now are gone, and we've replaced them with synthetics, foams, lightweight plastics, and things that really burn fast. And so we've reduced that time for interaction. What we used to call fire spreading beyond the room of origin is how we would speak about that. So if your fire starts from a cooking situation, or it spreads to the drapes nearby or whatever, or if it's something that was thrown away, maybe a candle ignited a curtain, wherever it started, once it moves beyond that room, then we would consider that whole room imploding, or called a flashover. Okay, that's the terminology. That means everything in that room ignited. And now it's going to spread beyond that room. Well, that's a dynamic that is significant for the fire service, because the fire is now much more dangerous. Well, if things are burning faster, you're going to reach that flashover point faster, which means if you're in that room with the ignition, your time for escape is now much shorter.
You've given us a different set of lenses to look at our environment through, right? Like the same things that are our assets, our homes, the place we live, our community. greenery outside that's close to our homes, personal property like our phones or our laptops or our cars or mobility devices. They have their benefits, but also a different dimension of risk that we're used to associating with them. And now, as we start to see that clearly, it also points us to the specific actions we might need to take to mitigate that risk in each of those cases, to be responsible in preventing the damage that may come from fire.
Absolutely.
So,
And just understanding it is half the battle, isn't it? Awareness, understanding, and now action. And sometimes I'll say it's knowledge, it's enlightenment, now action.
thank you so much for joining us. I've definitely learned a lot. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks for the focus on this subject. And everyone be fire safe.
As you heard in our conversation, Lori brings a hopeful and actionable approach towards the ways we can mitigate the potential damage from fire. One of the things that strikes me about the conversation with Lori is that she really underscores the point that while fire is inevitable, the risk from fire doesn't have to be. And this prompts us to look at things through a new lens. It helps us see the risks that are around us. For example, that beautiful garden in the front of your house, the wooden fence, the electric car, all of these are assets in our lives. But when we look at it through this lens, we can also see that if we don't treat them properly, they can contribute to the risk of fire. They can become fuel for the fire. At the same time, she also helps us maintain a focus on the fact that there are very concrete, actionable steps we can take that meaningfully reduce the risk from fire and help protect our homes, making us all safer. I'm Stuart Yasgur. This is Economic Architecture, the podcast. Stay tuned for future episodes of the Economic Architecture podcast. Available every Monday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, wherever you get your podcasts.